Hey folks, how are you doing? My name is Edward. Before I go into my spiel, I'd like for you to know that I'm not a specialized disability awareness trainer. Though I'm wearing my uniform, the Boy Scouts of America, BSA, or any other organization is not endorsing me in any way, shape, or form, and they probably don't even know I'm doing this. I'm a parent, probably just like you, who volunteers at his local scouting unit and who's had some curiosity about this topic, disability awareness, that directly and indirectly influences our lives. So I wanted to learn more about it and share this with you. Plus, this presentation is also part of my WoodBadge project, Bridge the Gap, part of Troop S4-88-18-1. Buffalo Patrol, go Troop 1. I'm going to work my ticket if I can. Also, if you're seeing this video on YouTube, like and subscribe if you find it informative and useful. What I'm sharing with you is a bit of what I learned through my life experiences and surface research. What you'll learn, I feel, are important first steps towards understanding and becoming aware of those around us who have disabilities. People with disabilities are just like you and I in most all respects, and they should be respected as such. Some of the information you'll get from my presentation, again, is from my own experience and life as a scouter. Other information, well, I have simply borrowed from other sources that have already done the legwork. There's no need for me to reinvent the wheel here. The information is in great abundance, know that. It's in great abundance, and I will provide you with where I got some of it and where you can go to find it yourself, should you want to pursue your own personal growth. Many of us don't really think about the term disabilities in the general scope of our lives. That's probably because most of us don't personally experience situations in our own lives, in our own families, that would require us to be constantly vigilant, aware, and understanding. That doesn't make us mean, insensitive, or uncaring. It just simply means that within the hustle and bustle of our daily lives, we don't necessarily actively think about the things that don't directly affect us in the moment. It's just how it is. We may get reminded daily about persons with disabilities by simple means such as parking signs, ramps, and other things at our favorite stores, restaurants, places of entertainment such as the movies, the theater, baseball stadiums, or we may have friends that have disabilities. But generally speaking, it's not the first thought on our minds because, as I just mentioned, it doesn't require immediate and constant attention. Think about it. Disabilities. Let that word ring in your mind just a moment. This is such a huge term, such an important topic that, for the purposes of this presentation, I want to highlight the nutshell in which I want to bring about the disability awareness, focusing on how it pertains to us as scouting unit and how we can welcome our friends and fellow scouts into our units who may be persons with disabilities. So, what's our purpose today? It's simple. Our purpose is to understand that awareness is key so that we can gain the knowledge, courage, and the wherewithal to develop stronger programs for our units, empower our youth through knowledge, and to teach empathy and awareness to our scouts, for our scouts. That said, how about we get started? Here's what we're covering today. Number one, what are the definitions and the differences between disabilities and handicap, and what is the proper term to use? Have you thought about that before? Well, we'll cover that in just a bit. Number two, what are some of the myths and facts about persons with disabilities? You'll be surprised on that. Number three, how can we welcome and foster an environment of inclusion to our fellow scouts with disabilities? And number four, how can we implement more awareness and understanding in our units? Let's get started. Number one, disabilities versus handicap. What are the definitions and the differences between the two, and which is the proper term to use? Let's define. Let's start with the Americans with Disabilities Act. They say, and I quote, "A person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. This includes people who have a record of such impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. It also includes individuals who do not have a disability but are regarded as having a disability. The ADA also makes it unlawful to discriminate against persons based on that person's association with a person with disability." That's a mouthful. Can you ingest that a little bit? How about we get another definition? Let's define this through the World Health Organization, the WHO. The WHO defines a handicapped person to have a loss or limited opportunity, or having a loss or limited opportunities in being involved in activities as compared to the majority of the population. A handicap is the effect of a disability. It focuses on an obstacle experienced by a person due to a restriction in the environment. Okay. It's another slightly different point of view, but about the same, right? Let's go to another source. How about Wikipedia, our favorite online source, right? Wikipedia says disability is consequence of an impairment that may be physical, cognitive, mental, sensory, emotional, developmental, or some combination of these. A disability may be present from birth or occur during a person's lifetime. They also go ahead and say a little something about handicap. They define that as any physical or mental defect, congenital at birth, or acquired, preventing or restricting a person from participating in normal life or limiting their capacity to work. Okay. That to me was as clear as a foggy day at night while walking around blindfolded. How about you? Well, let's break this down a little bit more. Here's how I translate that and kind of grab all that, put it together. See if that makes any sense, and hopefully I'm accurate to some degree. Here's how I see the differences between disability and handicap. My translation of disability says, it's an actual impairment of some sort that an individual has. Could be physical, emotional, cognitive, or any combination of the above. It is something within one's self. You can be born with it, or you can develop it later in life, either by illness, genetics, accidents, life. Life happens. Handicap, on the other hand, in my mind, is brought about, generally speaking, by external, usually environmental or educational factors that limit, prevent, or increase challenges to our current abilities that we may be faced with when attempting to accomplish certain feats or tasks. It can also be the direct effect of a disability. In other words, again in my mind, it boils down to experiencing difficulty or disadvantage as a direct result of external factors or a disability. So in essence, you don't necessarily have to be disabled based on the definition of disabled to experience a handicap. So here are some examples of a disability. Vision impairment, blindness, auditory impairment or full deafness, mental health conditions, cognitive impairment, brain injury that could become a disability, missing, damaged, or lost limb. All those are examples of what an actual could be a disability for an individual. How does that contrast with handicap? Handicap, I'm going to be a little facetious here in a way just to make a difference, okay? It doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but let's use this. Ability allowances, like a golf handicap. Sounds a little crazy, right? Non-pro versus pro. Maybe time allowances. Let's use a simple example. Timed race. An inexperienced runner versus an experienced runner running a race with a set parameters of time. Could be a broken leg. Broken leg could cause a problem for you and create a handicap. Foggy goggles. We'll get to that later. Inability or difficulty performing tasks like lifting or cognitive issues or anything of that nature. So these are things that typically are external factors that affect you or that can affect your ability. There's a comparison chart I found from difference between .NET. Now, you may or may not agree with some of the things on this chart, but they go ahead and they separate the handicapped versus disabled and give a little bit of an idea. Here, for example, handicapped, they do typically say, external source versus disability is more of an internal source. Handicap could be a lack or restriction of opportunity versus disabled is lack or restriction of ability, things of that nature. Just to give you a little bit of a comparison between more of a situational within you versus the outside factors that affect you. So we get to a point where we end up in a conundrum. That conundrum is which word is appropriate, which term is appropriate. Since this is all about disability awareness, we need to know what is the current appropriate term to use. Do we use disabled? Do we use persons with disabilities? Do we use handicap? What do we use? For a long time, people have used the term disability and handicap synonymously, interchangeably with one another. It's generally not done with many malice or malintent or meanness. It's just that we've understood them to be one in the same. Hey, I was in that boat too. But the truth is that they are not one in the same, as we've already learned. The older of the terms has been used in some way, shape, or form, and that is handicapped. It's when used to describe people with impairments or inabilities. But it wasn't until the 90s that the phrase person with disabilities came to describe those people with disabilities. So the conundrum is hopefully solved, at least for the time being. Since then, the current and correct term phrase, however you want to look at it, that is considered most respectful when describing a disabled person is person with disabilities. Handicap, on the other hand, has been relegated to being taken as a condescending term and therefore not usually accepted as a general descriptor of persons with disabilities. So, okay, I hope I was able to clear that up a little bit, at least shed some light that there is a difference between disability and handicap. So, what's next? 2. What are some myths and facts associated with persons with disability? Excuse me. I found a comprehensive list of these myths and facts that were derived from a training manual entitled Succeeding Together, People with Disabilities in the Workplace, a Curriculum for Interaction. Now, I know what you're hearing. You hear, in the workplace. But even though that manual is more geared towards adults with disabilities, I found that they do hold true to some degree to our youth on how things develop. Of course, experiences make a difference, age makes a difference, but in general, it holds true across the board. This manual was created by Terry Goldstein, Michael Winkler, and Margaret Chun, and I'll go ahead and give you that information after this little section here. That said, there are many myths about persons with disabilities, some of which I may have admittedly subscribed to in my earlier years in my life. I am going to highlight only and quote only a few of them derived from the Succeeding Together manual here. So remember, I'm quoting this. Number 1, deaf persons do not appreciate music, theater, movies, etc. because they cannot hear. What do you think? True or false? The answer is false. Today, many movies and television shows are captioned. That means that the conversations appear as words on the screen. If a program is open captioned, no special decoder is needed. If a show is closed captioned, a TV with a decoder is needed. The Americans with Disabilities Act mandates that all new televisions 13 inches and larger must include a built-in caption decoder. Many theaters offer special performances that are interpreted into sign language. And again, the type and degree of hearing loss, as well as the age of the person when they became deaf, also influences their appreciation of music. Number 2, certain jobs are more suited to persons with disabilities. What do you think on that one? That one is also false. As with all people, certain jobs may be better suited to some than to others. While there are obviously bad job matches, such as someone who is blind and wants to be a bus driver, or someone who is quadriplegic and wants to be a loader for a shipping company. But be careful not to pigeonhole people in or out of certain occupations based on their disability. Just because you can only think of one way to do something does not mean that other ways do not exist that are equally effective. Now, I know this is kind of focused on jobs, but looking to our scouts, same thing applies here. Kids are resilient. Kids are able to think outside of the box, sometimes much more than you and I. So think about that. Number 3, people with disabilities tend to do work and tasks of a higher quality than people without disabilities. What do you think of that? Give you a second here. This one's a little bit tricky. And it might hit your ego too. It is true. In several studies, it was found that 91% of the workers with disabilities scored average or better when compared with the general workforce. Their attendance was also better. Think about that. Number 4, all hearing impaired people can read lips. That is, survey says, false. Only about 15 to 25% of what we say is actually visible on the lips. Therefore, someone with hearing impairment relies on other cues such as facial expressions, body language, and residual hearing, usable hearing, in addition to reading somebody's lips. All of these cues combined are more accurately known as speech reading. Have you thought about that? Have you heard that before? Speech reading versus lip reading. Amount of usable hearing and knowledge of the English language are also important variables in the process. Ability to speech read is a skill not everyone can master and is not related to a person's intelligence. So that's another myth that's busted there. Next one. Blind people have exceptional hearing. What do you think? That one is false. A person's vision or lack of vision does not affect their hearing. However, someone who is blind may depend more on their hearing and be more attuned to sounds than a sighted counterpart. So, just because you're blind doesn't necessarily mean that you hear better, but you focus your senses in a different way. Have you heard about your senses taking over the losses of other senses? So that's where that comes into play. It's interesting how we can think so differently about things that may not follow a logical foundation, right? So now that we've debunked a few of the myths, let's tackle our third point. Oh, I'm sorry, before we get to that, here's that information I was telling you about, Succeeding Together, People with Disabilities in the Workplace, a curriculum for interaction. And these are the folks, Terry Goldstein, Michael Winkler, and Margaret Chun. So, let's get to number 3. How can we welcome and foster an environment of inclusion to our fellow scouts with disabilities? Well, we accomplish this by using 3 simple points. First, we work as a unit. This is so very important. And this includes parents who may not be official volunteers per se, but who participate in events with their units nonetheless. And leaders, just because your den may not have scout with disabilities, doesn't mean that you're off the hook. Remember, we are here to set the example, to lead by example for the scouts, to teach them. So how can we foster that environment of growth and inclusion? By our next point. But before we get to that, I want you to think. Sounds great and all. You may be saying to yourself that you don't have a unit that either has scouts with disabilities, or maybe you're new to the experience. So what do? gets to our fourth point. How can we implement more awareness and understanding in our units? Teach all your scouts to be aware of those persons with disabilities. Make sure not to teach in a manner that could result in feelings of pity or remorse for one another. Remember that, it's so very important. People with disabilities don't want to be pitied. They don't want to be looked down on. They want to be feeling as equal as possible, okay? So make sure not to teach in a manner that could result in feelings of pity or remorse for one another. Rather, teach in a way that emphasizes equality, inclusion, empathy, understanding, and respect for a fellow human being. These small lessons now will help forge stronger friendships and character in life. Plan ahead. Remember, you don't have to forego going camping because you may have a larger density of scouts with disabilities. Whether you have 1 or 100 scouts with special needs, make sure that the places you choose to have your campouts or outings have or can have accommodations for your scouts. Whether they have special physical or dietary needs, planning ahead allows for all your scouts to be inclusive with one another. Also, in today's day and age, it has become easier to plan ahead much more effectively than, say, 15 years ago. Remember, at the end of the day, it's all about the scouts. That's why you're doing this. Training. Get trained. There's an abundance of resources out there, just an incredible amount. Having the knowledge to tackle anything is half the battle. Lucky for you, you can go to scouting.org and look up disabilities and awareness. I'll have that link up over here as well. Older scouts. They can work towards earning specialized merit badges. Guide them on how they can earn those specialized advancements. You can also find that information again at scouting.org. Another way is through special pack and den meetings. You can bring about disability awareness to your scouts by having them participate in a handful of activities that will enlighten them and provide them through a subtle yet effective eye-opening way to experience a disability of some sort. For example, vision impairment. I'm calling this the goggle effect. I haven't seen it out there, so if it's not out there, I coined that. The goggle effect. But this is not a new way of methodology of teaching vision impairment. Basically, you get a bunch of goggles, you get your kids in your den, and lather some Vaseline on them and have them perform certain tasks with those goggles on. Of course, in a safe environment, but have them do it. Have them experience vision impairment. How about some hearing impairment? I call this the cotton ball baffle. Some of you will get that little play on words, but the cotton ball baffle. Basically, get a bunch of cotton balls, get them and put them in your ears, and have the kids talk in low voices or higher voices. Have them read out little blurbs of whatever was written out or excerpts from their manuals to one another and see if they can hear each other. See if they can understand each other. That's very important. It allows them to understand hearing loss. Missing limb test, paint away. Now this you might not want to do with your new little lions, but maybe tigers and above can handle this. Basically, have them with their hands behind their back, with a little paintbrush in their mouth, and have them paint something without using their hands. That's an interesting way to look at it. It gives them the ability to experience being able to do something without their hands and see if they can accomplish it, overcome that obstacle. The other thing is trying something with non-functioning limbs, the right now. How can you do that? If you're right-handed, have your scout put his hand behind his back and get his other hand, unless, and I say him, but it could be him or her because we do have the girls too. Have your scout write their name or phrase or word or sentence using their non-dominant hand. So if they're right-handed, hand behind the back, use left. If they're left-handed, use your right hand. So anything to do with opposite of the dominant hand. Okay? These are just some little tricks, little ideas, little thoughts to plant the seed to our scouts so they can understand and be aware of what having a disability or some kind of impediment feels like. There's so much more than can be discussed, but the whole idea here was to bring you more awareness about folks with disabilities than you probably had, along with ideas on how you can share that knowledge with your scouting units and families. Also, I know that there are those of you who live, eat, and breathe this stuff, so I welcome any constructive, respectful comments about this video, keeping in mind its scope and its audience. In other words, keep it relevant and rated E for everyone. Our objective, my objective, is to educate and bridge the gap, not objectify. If you found at least a little more importance of being disability aware and that this video was informative and worth your time, then I did my job. Please like this video below and share it with others if you find it useful. Let's make our scouting unit stronger, better informed, and better equipped together. Remember that our efforts in anything we do within our scouting units as leaders are, at the end of the day, all about our scouts. Folks, that's disability awareness in a nutshell.